you need a little perspective of this whole business of cryptology, which is the art or science of writing or creating hidden messages, messages that are intended for a specific receiver and denied others. And cryptanalysis is the science of reading them anyway. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that just to give you a flavor of that. Before we get into the hidden codes that are in the Bible, we're also going to discover there's lots of different kinds, but the kinds that's creating all the controversy are a specific kind of code called the equidistant letter sequences. And we'll show you what that means, and we'll talk a little bit about why people are so excited about them. We'll also talk a little bit about the dark side, the dangers of these things. Your secret codes, we've been interested, all of us I think have been fascinated by secret codes ever since we were kids in one kind or another. And of course it's been extolled in the literature. Edgar Allan Poe's famous story, The Gold Bug, still remains as one of the classics of stories in which the whole thing hangs upon the discovery of and then the deciphering of a secret code. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle and his creation of Sherlock Holmes is, of course, turns out his man Sherlock Holmes is an expert in cryptography also, and we find in the Adventure of the Dancing Men that Sherlock Holmes recognized that these funny little stick figures that are not just some kind of embroidery, that they are in fact an encryption, and he breaks the code and traps the thief with it, as of course only Sherlock Holmes can. And but even in more recent times, Carl Sagan, who wrote a novel called Contact, which of course has been made into a blockbuster movie that I imagine most of you have seen. That movie also takes advantage of an extraterrestrial code that's three-dimensional, and a very creative novel, quite a story, and a well-made movie. But the most serious codes are codes of war, and we'll touch a little bit about that as we go through. I think all of us probably have heard at one time or another of the famous encryption machines, the Enigma machines of Nazi Germany, that rendered a code that was considered invulnerable. And the Japanese did a rendering of it too. These, of course, derived from Alberti's cipher disks and Cardano's auto key from the Middle Ages, from the Renaissance period. We'll talk a little bit about that. But it's interesting that the Germans had broken the American code, which in those days was called black. But one of the main milestones in World War II was on October 23rd of 1942, when General Rommel and his much vaunted Africa Corps were defeated at El Alamein. What most people don't realize is that up till El Alamein, the Germans had the advantage of reading our codes, but we discovered that finally. And what happened at El Alamein, the tables were reversed. And as Churchill said, we never had a victory until El Alamein. But after El Alamein, we never had a defeat. And what turned the tide, of course, was the turning the tide of our cryptology at that time. And that continued during World War II. In London, they had a super secret project called Project Ultra, which, unknown to the Germans, had cracked their code, the Enigma code. And there are two world-class mathematicians that have gone down in history. One is Alan Turing of London and John von Neumann of the United States. And these two brilliant mathematicians were very much behind. They were the brain trust, if you will, of the Ultra project, and they were able to not only break Enigma, but keep up with its continuing permutations. And our ability to read their codes was a major, major part of our success during the war. What's interesting is the Japanese took a version of Enigma and advanced it, and it was codenamed by the Americans as Purple. William Friedman worked day and night for about 20 months. He ultimately had a nervous breakdown as a result of this effort, but he was able to crack the Japanese Purple code. In fact, one morning he deciphered one of their codes which announced the day and the hour of Pearl Harbor. And it's a very dramatic story as his pulse quickening, runs through the streets of Washington early that morning to his superiors to warn them of this cracking of the Japanese code and the forthcoming attack on Pearl Harbor. But it's kind of interesting. The Germans had discovered that we'd cracked Purple and leaked it to Tokyo, but Tokyo didn't believe it because they knew their code was invulnerable. Well, when Friedman cracked the code and discovered the message, unraveled a message that mentioned the day and hour of Pearl Harbor, his superiors didn't believe it. They just couldn't believe it was true. It was too preposterous, so they chose to ignore it. And, of course, you know the story of Pearl Harbor. This anecdote not only dramatizes the urgency of codes, especially in terms of national security, but it's also interesting that both the Japanese, with regards to their own code, the information that their code was cracked, and also the naval seniors that dismissed William Friedman. William Friedman was the head of the fledgling little organization called the Signal Information Service that later became the National Security Agency, our largest and most well-resourced of all our 7 major intelligence agencies. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit. But it's interesting that the tendency today of many biblical scholars to dismiss out of hand the codes in the Bible seem to echo, in my mind, the same skepticism that characterized those situations back in World War II. But one of the questions that we all must have is, are there really hidden messages in the Bible? There are people that say, now wait a minute, God's truth is available to the common man without computers and deciphering equipment. That's certainly true. God's truth, His truth of redemption, His plan of redemption, is available to any of us. Jesus Himself said it would please the Father to release them to babes and hide them from the wise and prudent. So clearly that view is correct on the one hand. But it's a big mistake, I believe, by some very prominent writers to take the view that there's nothing in the Bible that the common man can't understand. There's a big difference in those two viewpoints. The fact that God's central truth about His redemption is available to any of us, independent of our intellect, training, background, what have you. That's certainly true, no question about it. But on the other hand, I think it's putting God in a strange box to argue that there's nothing in His Word that we can't understand. That implies that we can understand everything He does, and that's absurd. In fact, God Himself deals with this at several places, but one is Proverbs 25:2, where He declares that it is the glory of God to conceal a thing, but the honor of kings to search out a matter. It says two things. It says God has hidden things here for our pursuit. But He also points out that the pursuit of His revealed truth is an honorable undertaking. It's the honor of kings to search out a matter. There is a gray area we'll talk about before we're through, but I'll mention it right up front. There's a difference between trying to search the codes to discover what God has revealed in His program. And there's a difference between that and using the Bible as some kind of Ouija board or tea leaves or instrument for divination. So there's two kinds of people, two kinds of enthusiasts I run into. Those that deny the codes altogether and those that are excessively enthusiastic about them. There's also, among the latter, there are people that are getting into Bible codes for the wrong reasons, and they'll go down the wrong paths. And that's the attempt to use it for divination, which is expressly prohibited. But let's get into this a little bit. Let's just indulge me a little bit, and I'll give you a quick tutorial on methods of concealing codes and messages. There are two kinds of ways of concealment. One is called steganography, and that's using invisible inks or hiding a message in a microdot or putting it in the heel of a shoe, the mechanical ways of hiding the existence of a message at all. And we're obviously not concerned with that here. The other way of hiding a message is called cryptography. And cryptography indulges in two kinds of cryptograms. One is called a code. Most of us use that term very broadly, but in the field it's used very definitively, and I'll explain what a code is in a minute, as in contrast to a cipher. Codes and ciphers are different within the trade. I'm speaking now from a viewpoint of cryptology. And what we're going to be mostly interested in are ciphers, not codes, as you will see, and there's two kinds of ciphers, transposition and substitution. Now, let me just mention codes and dismiss them for a moment. A code is a prearranged signal. Let me give you the classic, simplest example, and that was Paul Revere as he stood on the bank looking across at the Old North Church. And he watched to see the lanterns. And if there was one if by land, two if by sea was the code. And that was a prearranged signal. And so he waited there and he watched the Old North Church. He saw the lantern go on. And he paused, and a second lantern, and so then he quickly knew they were coming by sea, mounted his horse to spread the word. It was a very critical piece of military intelligence. The point being is that was just a prearranged signal as such. If the British had the most modern computers in the world, there's no way they could have unraveled those one or two bits, if you will. A code typically depends on a code book in real life. The number 976 might mean some particular thing that you look up in a code book. That's what a code is, really. Some people have used during wartime, and they're in the field undercover, they've used the Gideon Bible as a code book. And what you send to your partner is a series of numbers that represent the page, the sentence, and the word in the Bible. And you just send them a series of numbers, and unless you know what the code book is, in this case it's a commonly available code book that's available in any hotel room, and you can use that in effect to create a message. Those things are used, but they have some serious limitations. Most modern cryptographic communication occurs with ciphers as opposed to codes, and a cipher is one in which you take your message and you do one of two things, or combination thereof, these two things. You transpose the letters or you substitute for the letters, and we'll talk about that. That's really what we're interested in here. Now, the first form of ciphers are called transposition ciphers. That's where all you do is change the order of things. One of the oldest forms of transposition ciphers occurred with a staff. What a person would do in the ancient days, he would take a strip of parchment and he would wrap it on the staff so that the edges touched, and he'd write his message horizontally around the staff and then unravel it. And when you saw the strip, you'd just have a whole bunch of letters. And he would send that. All his receiver needed was a staff of exactly the same diameter, and he would wrap it and unravel the message. That happens to be called a skytail, just by historical reasons. And a skytail also happens to be in the logo of the American Cryptogram Association, which is the club of amateur cryptographers. But it's obviously not very useful. It happens to be, by the way, a equidistant letter sequence, the same kind of codes you find in the Bible, strangely, but for different reasons. A more common use, more effective than that obviously was very easy to intercept and break. Let's take what's called a rail fence cipher. This is one of the simplest ciphers that are used among people who play games. A lot of people like to do crossword puzzles as sort of a recreation. How many of you do crossword puzzles? Well, see, some people would say the ultimate crossword puzzle is a cryptogram. And there are columns and clubs and stuff. People just love to try to break the cryptograms. And one of the most common ones is what's called a rail fence cipher. And by the way, in the field of cryptology, the text that you're trying to preserve or understand or whatever is called the plain text. That's the unencrypted text, the plain text. And let's assume our message is please help now. One of the things we can do is write it up and down, as you see on the screen, in sort of a zigzag fashion. And here we just take please help now, we lay it out that way, and then we simply read across the top, the PHN, the LEEE, etc. And so our cipher text of that plain text would be that stream of letters reading this rail fence cipher horizontally. And it's easier to see than it is to describe, but basically that's one way of scrambling these. It happens to be a very easy one to break, as you can probably imagine. You can make some stabs at how many levels the guy has used in his rail fence, and it generally quickly will yield to analysis. But a more advanced form of that same idea that gets much more sophisticated is what's called a columnar transposition. In other words, transposing by columns. And in the field, they don't speak of transpositions. They use an abbreviation, and you can't say transp very easily. So the street language for a transposition is a tramp. It's just they call them columnar tramps, but it's just a shorthand for columnar transposition. Here is a message written out in 6 columns. Cinderella, be home before midnight. Okay, so it's just an example, obviously, but it's written first just across in horizontally, but keep maintaining 6 columns. Now, what you could do, of course, is just rewrite this then vertically, CEHFD, etc. But there's a better way to do this. Typically, 2 people exchanging cryptograms have a code word associated with them. In this way, or a keyword or a code word. In this case, let's assume you out there in the field and myself here had agreed that the word darkly is our code word. Now, this might be something we could change from time to time over a phone or whatever. But if the keyword is darkly, what they typically would do is alphabetize the letters in the keyword and then use those as a key as to what order to use the columns. In other words, darkly would become A-D-K-L-R-Y, putting the letters in darkly alphabetical. And A turns out to be the second letter in darkly, so it's the first column is 2. D is the first letter. In other words, if you take them in alphabetical order and then take the number in which they appear in that word, that's a simple way of reshuffling the columns. Then with those numbers, I write the transposition vertically, but taking the columns in that order. So the first column that I'd write is the second column in here. So you see, if I number these columns 1 through 6, I'll take the first vertical string from the second column, then the first, then the fourth, then the fifth, then the third, and the sixth, that order. And so my ciphertext then looks like what you see at the bottom of the screen. The I-L-O-O-N being the vertical lineup of the second column, etc. Something else you'll notice right away, it's typical to take an encryption and group it in clusters of 5 letters, just to make it easy to count them. You rarely do you ever preserve the spaces, which leads to the first point in cryptography. In cryptography, you generally don't have spaces between the words, because that's a tip-off, generally. There's some other things you'll discover as we go, but that's one of the things. Now, another technique that was developed very, very early, we're talking, before the 15th century, etc., one of the Renaissance men, who also happened to be you'll discover something else. The great men, I'm sparing you a whole historical buildup here, but the great men of cryptology of the past were typically also Jewish Kabbalists. The Jewish scribes, centuries before Christ, indulged in all kinds of letter games. We'll talk about some of those as we go. And cryptology didn't advance much until about the 13th, 14th century, which happened to be the flowering period of the Talmudic sages, but it also was the time in Europe in the Renaissance where cryptology, for a variety of reasons, just flowered. And most of the great men in cryptology also came, interestingly enough, from that Hebrew background. One of these was Cardano, and one of the techniques he indulged in was to create a grill, which is known as the Cardano grill. What you do is you take a piece of cardboard or metal or whatever, and you cut out holes in it. You can cut them out wherever you like, but the idea is you need to make 2 of them. You have one, and the receiver, your correspondent, needs one. And let's assume now we took a message, and I'm using a clumsy example here, for leverage try-only serials listed in Social Lovers editions. You say, what does that mean? Doesn't matter, because what you really want to do, watch carefully, you want to take your Cardano grill that you've hidden away in your secret place, and you lay that over the message, and then you read just the letters that show through the holes. Now, in this case, if you read those letters, it says, "Flee at once, all is discovered." And so that's a very simple way of having a code. And obviously the notion here is that if someone who intercepts that note, unless he happens to have a grill exactly like you and your partner has, he has no chance of breaking it. That turns out not to be true, incidentally. And one of the problems with a Cardano grill, and one reason I selected this as an example, because I want you to notice a defect of it. Let's assume you've gone ahead and written your message, "Flee at once, all is discovered," through that grill. You're then faced, as I was for the slide, to come up with a message. You fill in the other blanks with letters to make it look like a normal note. Well, it turns out that's not easy to do. You take a page and just put some random letters on it, and then try to fill in between them words that make the thing sound like a love note or an instruction or whatever. Do you follow me? It sounds easy, but it takes a great deal of imagination to really do it well. And obviously I've done it poorly here for 2 reasons. One is I'm not that skilled, but secondly, I wanted to highlight a point. If you saw this message, you would begin to sense that there's something fishy about it. See, it doesn't make sense. So because it doesn't make sense, or there's a hint that there's something deeper, In the Hebrew, that's called a remez, and it's a thing that the rabbis use even today with the Old Testament text, and I'll come back to that. So that's a major defect of the Cardano grill. A variation of the Cardano grill was what was used by the French and the Germans in the First World War, called the turning grill. It's possible, and you can design these for any number of characters, but I'm using here as an example a 6x6 grill. That allows you 6 times 6 or 36 letters. It's possible to punch out holes, 1 letter each, in such a way that as you turn this grill in 4 different positions, it will cover all the squares, as you'll see in a minute. Let's assume you had this grill, and instead of a message, I'm just going to use numbers 1 through 9. The first 9 of your numbers, you just put in those holes. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9. Then what you do is you take your grill and you turn it 90 degrees, and you fill in the ones that are then exposed. 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, and 18. Then again, you turn it another 90 degrees and fill in the remainder. And then you do it once again and fill in those remainders, and you now have your 36 letters rearranged in a very unusual way. Now you say, gee, what if I don't have 36 letters in my message? It's not a problem. You put in what are called nulls. You throw in X's or something, whatever, to fill it out so you have the square. That's the idea. You could also design these for any square grill you want. This looks very, very, you can imagine that if you got the letters in that kind of a thing, it would really be a formidable code to break. That turns out not to be true. These codes lasted only 4 months before they were broken and became useless in the war. It turns out that these controversial equidistant letter sequences that we find being talked about that appear to be in the Bible are simply like a Cardano grill, but with the simplest possible formula. Instead of a grill with all the little holes cut out, you could just agree that every 5th letter or every 3rd letter or whatever, if you had the formula for creating the grill, it's the same thing as having the grill. Any fixed sequence of skipped letters is in effect a Cardano grill, and that's what we're going to find is in our Bible and someplace else that's very, very surprising. Someplace else that's very, very surprising. I'll come back to that later. Now, these equidistant letter sequences, you quickly will discover, are not very useful for sequency. A fixed letter sequence is easy to break. That's why they're breaking them. Okay? But they are useful for another reason, and that's to authenticate a source. And let me explain what I mean by that. Let's assume you're in a foreign country, you're operating undercover as a secret agent, and they know you're there. They don't know who is the secret agent, but they know they've been compromised. There's a mole in headquarters or something. So what your host country has done is they start generating all kinds of letters, notes, messages, and they drown you. Your problem is you've got all these messages. You don't know which one is really from your control, from your headquarters. So how do you solve that problem? Your life depends on figuring out which of these letters is the genuine one, which one isn't. And the way you do that, of course, is to have methods of authentication. And methods of authentication, obviously, typically, rely upon having some attribute of that message that's known only to you and your sender, that eludes the ability to counterfeit it. And we're going to discover that's exactly what happens in these 66 messages that we've brought with us to this meeting tonight. Now, before I go on, let me talk about another kind of code. We've talked so far about transposition ciphers, ciphers that depend on simply scrambling letters that are of the plain text. A far more powerful form of encryption is to substitute different letters or symbols for each of the letters in your message. And we're going to talk, the simplest form of this is what's called a monoalphabet. That's where you create a cipher alphabet and you use that alphabet, and I'll show you that in a minute. There's also polyalphabetic and polygraphic ones and some other things we'll talk about in a minute. But let's get to these monographic. The first one I'm going to use is the simplest form of monoalphabetic cipher you can have. And let's assume your plain text message you're trying to encrypt is, "This is a fascinating book." Just a simple sentence. What you could choose to do is to substitute for each of those letters the 3rd letter next in the alphabet. In other words, instead of the T, there's U, V, W, you'd put a W for the T, etc. And then your ciphertext then would simply be a stream of letters in each case is 3 letters further in the alphabet, a fixed sequence of shifts, if you will. And you obviously would group them in groups of 5, not with the word breaks in the plain text, so you won't tip off the word breaks, and that's, again, typical practice. Now, this is called, for historical reasons, a Caesar cipher. I mention it only because the next step in this, later on we'll talk about, is where the shift of the alphabet is not a fixed number, but a variable number somehow. And that starts to get very, very complicated. Now, generally, the simplest form of cipher alphabets is where you have one-on-one mapping. For example, you could take your alphabet A through Z, then you take an alphabet and shuffle it and match it. So this is the blue letters on the slide would be the cipher text letters. The yellow ones or gold ones would be the plain text. So what you would do is simply substitute for the plain text the corresponding cipher text. For example, the word enemy would become SWSHP because the E of the enemy would be substituted by an S, and the N by a W, the E by another S, the M by an H, and the P by a Y. Going the other way, if you had the RIS as a code, you would plug it into your alphabet here, and the R would become an F, the I, the O, and the S would be an E, and you'd decrypt it backwards. This one-on-one mapping is typically the kind of text that is usually facilitated by a cipher wheel, where you have the alphabet and then some mixed alphabet. And these are also sometimes little code wheels that they sell on the back of cereal boxes and things for kids. But it's a one-on-one mapping concept. Now, it doesn't take much imagination to realize that has some deficiencies. In fact, back here you'll notice that even with the word enemy and the word foe, you'll notice that the S's appear as frequently as the E's. Anybody that's trying to break code knows that there's a frequency behavior. E is the most common letter. So the most common letter in your ciphertext is suspicious of being an E, and that you'd like to break that down. So one way to do that is not to have a fixed alphabet, but to have multiple alphabets. And Leon Battista Alberti in the 15th century is one of the great pioneers. Many of the major advances in cryptography are attributed to him. He invented a thing called the Vigenère polyalphabetic cipher. Another guy's name is attached to it somehow through history, but it was really Alberti's invention. We'll talk about that in a minute. It's like a Caesar's cipher that we talked about, except there's a variable rotation. The alphabet is continually changed at each letter. That makes it pretty tough and there's some other variations I'll spare you. If you look at this, is called a Vigenère table, and basically you have the alphabet A through Z, but then you copy a second copy of it where you shift it 1. It starts at B, goes through Z, and then A, and you keep shifting it 1 for 26 times. And you'll label each one of these with a letter. So you've got a two-way table here, very easy to construct. You have that handy when you're doing this. What you typically do is first of all, when you're going to encrypt, you have a code word that's agreed between you and your partner. Now, in this particular case, I'm going to assume that we've just decided long ago that you and I are going to use a code word, a keyword called dog. D-O-G is our code word. Now, let's assume, to make this example very simple, but you'll quickly get the idea, I'm going to assume that I want to encrypt the name Jim. So my first problem, I have a keyword D. So I find the D across the top, and I find the J for Jim along the plain text. I move in both column and row, and I pick up the M where those two intersect. And so the first letter in my ciphertext is an M. For my second letter, I go to the second letter of the keyword, which is an O. I go to the second letter of my plain text, which is an I, and I move into the column and row represented by those two letters, and I have a W. So W becomes the second letter of my ciphertext. It's quicker to do than it is to talk about it. The next letter of my keyword would be third letter in the dog. Third letter in my plain text is an M, so I go to the row and column represented by that, and I pick up my S. And so my first three letters become MWS. The point being, I have used 3 different alphabets to encrypt this. What I would continue to do if my message was longer is I would always use, I'd write my message and put dog, 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 dog across, and always use the intersection of those two. Quickly, it obviously makes more sense to have a longer keyword than dog. I use this just to make a simple slide. The longer the key, the point is every time, every letter in my keyword gives me a different alphabet to encrypt. And that makes it a very, very powerful form of encryption. Now, you can make this whole process dynamic. In fact, Wegener, for whom this is named, developed what he called the auto key. And what he did after the first letter, what he used was the ciphertext result as the key to the key for the next letter. So it was a continually mutating alphabet that changed depending on what the message was. Very, very powerful technique. And in effect, what he really did, and I won't go through an example, it'll just take us too long. I want you to get the flavor of these things, is that if each letter of the encrypted, as you build up your encryption, the last letter you developed becomes the key to the next one. So you, in effect, make the top row not a keyword. It then becomes the previous ciphertext letter, if you will. This leads to another invention that Blaise de Wegener almost developed. Came close to it, didn't quite. What developed was what's called the one-time pad. This is probably the only form of cryptography that is unbreakable. And what it depends on is in order to have a code unbreakable, you need a key that is as long as the message. It needs to be totally random, and it must never be reused. If you can meet those three criteria, it is unbreakable. It's the only code that is unbreakable. Now, the way you implement this is to build tablets of random numbers. But you have two, so your associates and yours match. And then you use those to build your encryptions, if you will. And it's a tricky business, but it is unbreakable. And so modern ciphers use millions of continually changing cipher alphabets. And they obviously do this with machinery. There's another type of cipher I want to make you just sensitive to, and that's up till now we've had each letter stand on its own. Each letter was translated. There is a power when you start using letters together. They're called polygraphic ciphers, where two or more letters operate together. And I want to give you an example of one that the German spies used, well, the British used earlier in World War I time period, Boer War and others, and the Germans actually used it in America during World War II. And it starts by building a little simple, take your alphabet and make a 5 by 5 matrix out of it. And I'm showing you one here that just goes A through Z. And to make it 25 rather than 26 letters, they usually agree to use I and J as the same letter. It's a little awkward, but it works. And that way you've got a 5 by 5 matrix, which is what you're after, as you'll see in a minute. I'm also showing you this where the alphabet just goes A through Z. This is not the way it's normally done. What you want to do is have a code word or code phrase that you both agree on. You put the letters from that code phrase in here first, never repeating. You take the letters of the alphabet in the order that they're in that phrase and put those first, and whatever's left over you put at the end. Do you follow me? That way, the arrangement here is not predictable to a stranger. You say, that sounds like kind of clumsy. No, it isn't. There's actually a very popular way of doing this. What the Germans did is they would use a Gideon Bible in the hotel room. And they would use the book of Proverbs, and they would take the chapter for the day of the week, the day, because there's 31 chapters, and then they would take the verse that corresponds to the month. There's no verses, there's no chapters there that have more than 12 verses, or less than 12 verses. So by knowing the date, and if you date the note, by knowing that date, you go to a Gideon Bible, you can take that verse, you can take the alphabet in the order it's in that verse, plug it in here, and you've got your keyword taken care of. But then what they did, let's assume our plain text, take something very simple, must come now. The first thing they do is take those in pairs. They take the MU, then the ST, and always take them in pairs, because we're going to encrypt not letters, but letter pairs. Very interesting idea here. And obviously, since there's an odd number of letters, we throw an X in there just to make it come out even. And what we do then, the M and U on our little array here become the diagonal of a rectangle. And we simply take the other pair of letters opposite that, where the MU, see the little rectangle, become RP. So the first two letters get enciphered to RP. The next two letters are ST. And there again we have a rectangle. In this case they're on the same row, so we just take the letters below them XY. The next pair of letters is CO, and they become the ND. Again, because they're, see, the ND is, the CO represents a rectangle, the ND is in the opposite corner of it. And the ME, again, is the opposite, it becomes the diagonal of a rectangle, the opposite ones are the BP. The NO are together, so we take the ones below. And the WX are below, we just assume a wraparound, get the BC at the top. You say that seems like a strange way to go thing. It's the kind of thing that requires no special equipment. You can do it in any hotel room, and it turns out to be tough to break. And the ciphertext, of course, then is rewritten in groups of 5 in standard form. This undercuts some of the major tools, monographic tools, of frequency analysis that a cryptanalyst would use, because it obliterates the single letter characteristics. It cuts in half the number of elements that are being encrypted, and it also, the number of possible digraphs exceed the number of letters that are available. So it turns out statistically it's a very powerful technique. So we've talked about monoalphabets, Caesar one-way mapping. We've talked about polyalphabetic kinds of encryptions. We've talked about polygraphic techniques. There's another last thing I'll just mention for your background called block substitution, where you take blocks of information and you have much more powerful techniques there. One of the examples of this in modern days is the National Bureau of Standards Data Encryption Standard. And this is a standard that uses 64-bit keys that controls 17 stages of polyalphabetic substitutions, which alternate with 16 different transpositions. So by the time you crunch all that, it has a very high level, not perfect, but a very, very high level encryption. And this is dear to me because when I was chairman of Western Digital, we really say what got Western Digital out of bankruptcy is we were the first to put this on a single chip for commercial use. And that was not that big a deal, but it did bring the company out of Chapter 11, and it was dear to my heart as one of our projects. But what this does require virtually is an exhaustive search of 2 to the 64th power keys. Now, a fast computer can do that, and so these things are breakable, but only with an enormous amount of computer crunching. Now, there's other topics we could talk about. There are fractionating schemes where you can render your message into a matrix, and then you can do mathematical operations on the matrix, and I won't get into those here. There are also a strange thing that's developed called one-way keys. It's possible to develop a form of encryption in which I can make the key public. It takes a different key to encrypt than it does to decipher. So I give you what's called the public key. If you send me a message encrypting it with that key, nobody can unravel it except me. Even though you have the key to encipher it, you don't have the key to decipher it. It's a very strange mathematical phenomenon. They're called one-way keys, which means that they can be used publicly, not just for encryption, but for also authenticating signatures. Because in the Department of Defense contract world and so forth, you can actually commit to things in an encrypted form. We can prove that you were the one that okayed the drawing or whatever because of the one-way key. Only you have the key and so forth. So there are ways to do that. So if you're interested in this kind of thing, it's available on the internet. There's a thing called PGP, means for pretty good protection. There are all kinds of modern, very advanced encryption techniques that the U.S. government is very upset about because they've gotten out in the public domain, and you can get these on the internet if you're really interested in that sort of thing. These devices, Alberti made his cipher disks. Wheatstone made a similar thing. These mechanical aids to do encryption, of course, started to develop through the years. Thomas Jefferson, our president, had invented a certain kind of variation that's called the Thomas Jefferson wheel. But this finally climaxes to a guy by the name of Charles Babbage, who was busy making tables, and he took those ideas and made a very elaborate version of it that became the first computer. The Babbage differential engines. These things also became the background that the Germans picked up on to make the Enigma machines that became so famous in World War II. And of course were ultimately defeated by Alan Turing and John von Neumann's programmable machines from which came our modern computer. John von Neumann was the guy that recognized the power in putting a program. See, the only difference between a computer and a calculator is that a computer is a calculator that pushes its own buttons, in effect, because the program that the computer follows is in memory, which means the computer can modify its program. And you now start to have self-modifying machines. And that's where you start getting into cognitive behavior, start getting into artificial intelligence and the rest. And that's really the breakthrough. That leads to what you and I know as modern computers. What fascinates me is the way the ellipse is closed, because Alberti's cipher disk and these encryption techniques had their roots in the Kabbalah, the ancient Hebrew texts, which we'll see shortly. From that came the cipher disk, which came the machines, from which came the computer, and now it's the computer that are rediscovering what the ancient Kabbalists had discovered thousands of years ago. And we're going to get into that shortly. Now, a related field to cryptology is paracryptology. Egyptian hieroglyphics being perhaps the classic example. Hieroglyphics have fascinated people for centuries because they're so mysterious. But Jean-Francois Champollion is the one that really cracked them using cryptographic techniques. There's a close relationship between cryptology and trying to decipher the language of a lost culture. There are some differences because the language of a lost culture did not have as its design secrecy, you see, so it has that advantage. But on the other hand, you've got the problem of trying to get an insight from scratch as to what the various symbols and things meant. Another example is Henry Rawlinson was climbing. There's a huge cliff at the Histun in which is engraved in 3 languages, Babylonian, Old Persian, and Elamite. It's very similar to a Rosetta Stone kind of thing. But he clinging like a fly to this giant prehistoric billboard, he copied this and cracked these ancient languages, and so that's a whole area of reading. But having said all that, what interests, probably the greatest challenge in the minds of the people who are into this thing is the challenge of deciphering messages of extraterrestrial origin. And back in 1961, they undertook the Project Ozma, where they put a special receiver on a radio telescope and they tried to listen for signals from outer space. And they did that for 4 months without any real tangible result, but they were nevertheless trying. In 1971, there was a conference where 84 of the top scientists on the planet Earth, American and Soviet and others, that met at Byukhatan, Russia, with the National Academy of Sciences of the Soviet Union, co-sponsored with the National Academy of Sciences of the United States. These 84 guys in 1971 met in a conference to explore the problems and likelihoods and so forth with communication with extraterrestrial intelligence. The proceedings of that conference are available and translated into English, and they're very fascinating reading because these 84 scientists, in effect, as they address this problem, also find themselves pointing out to themselves that the very existence of life is unique. There's absolutely no statistical basis. In other words, it's a refutation in great erudite terms of the whole theory of evolution, in effect, although that was not their intent. Well, out of that, of course, came this project called the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence, we all probably have heard about, where there's diligent attempts to try to listen for intercepts from outer space. And as you listen for these signals, you want something that is, most things are either periodic, repeatable, which means they probably have a natural source, or they're straight noise, they're totally random. The signal you're looking for is something in between, not random and not periodic. That's the dilemma. It may surprise you to discover that they have actually, most of us see the movie Contact and assume, well, that's just fiction, it's kind of fun, but it's fiction. There actually have been 37 intercepts by the SETI organization of messages, apparent messages from outer space. The problem is they don't repeat. They're unique and don't repeat. They've been published in the Journal of Astronautics and Aeronautics, but they don't know what to do with them because they're not repeatable. So it's a matter of record, but they don't know what to do with it. Not enough to decode. I'll spare you because it's getting late going through the history of science from Descartes on, all the scientists and mathematicians that have spent their time trying to figure out what would an extraterrestrial language, what kind of requirements would it have to meet. There's a bunch of these. It quickly becomes clear that they have to meet certain statistical tests. Jean-Francois Soudre proposed a 7-note, 7-color kind of alphabet for extraterrestrial communication. That was just his proposal. I mention it only because it's an interesting proposal because Spielberg picked up on that. He took a 5-note, 5-color scheme in his blockbuster movie and so forth called Close Encounters of the Third Kind. But he's really leaning on Soudre's technical work way back long ago. Alfred North Whitehead, Bertrand Russell have written the basic foundation for this, that mathematics and logic are actually identical and would have to underlie any such language. Dr. Hans Freudenthal is famous as having really formulated the first a language for interstellar use called Linkos, and I won't go into this. They're just studies to try to explore what some of the problems are. Now, Pioneer 10, which was the first space vehicle that was put on a trajectory that would go beyond our solar system. And as it left our solar system, of course, it was a big fanfare. And knowing that it was going to do that, they put a plaque on it. And the intent of the plaque was should, whenever, millions of years from now or whenever, some outside extraterrestrial civilization encounters this thing, they'll find this plaque, and this plaque had the burden of somehow trying to communicate to them some things about us. Now, I have a little cartoon I refrained from putting in here, but it says that one guy, one space being says to another space being, gee, all we know about the Earth people is they don't wear clothes. But the intent was to indicate that people, there's all kinds of basic scientific mathematical relationships on the plaque, proportions of our planets in our solar system, all kinds of binary and mathematical. But anyway, it was an attempt. But the retreat to pictures is interesting because most people presume that a basic communication will involve pictures because they're concrete. Arthur C. Clarke has suggested that. One of the oldest languages on the planet Earth, of course, is Chinese, and Chinese consists of pictographs. You say, well, that seems very natural, except there's some problems with pictographs. How does a pictograph portray an abstract concept? A little tough. Pictures have their limitations. One of the startling discoveries of just the last few decades, see, China, well, it's one of the few civilizations that can point to a 4,500-year history of their development. And most of us think of China in terms of Taoism, Buddhism, or Confucianism, but that's all since the 5th century BC forward. Their religion goes back several thousand years prior to that, and it was a worship of one God. They've discovered by studying the pictographs for abstract concepts convey those concepts by the presumption that the viewer knows the stories of Genesis 3. And that's a startling discovery. It demonstrates that the original Chinese apparently had common awareness of the stories of Genesis, the early chapters of Genesis. Very, very interesting discovery. I know, monotheistic culture. But I won't spend our time on that. But pictures make sense. Skull and crossbones on a medicine bottle means many things in many languages. We see it on road signs, chemical formulas, notes of music, Arabic numerals. All these are, of course, symbols of wide application. But what if you saw an extraterrestrial language today, how would you recognize it if you saw it? What would be its characteristics? Would it be pictorial, conceptual, or phonetic? Most of our alphabets are phonetic. They're like sounds, but they're meaningless except to the fact that you've learned those sounds. What kind of a language would it look like? How would the language be parsing? In other words, we're used to a string of letters broken with spaces for words and periods for sentences. How would an extraterrestrial language parse itself? It would somehow have to be self-parsing other than just a random string of letters. Another question has to do with the use of redundancy. I have a group of letters here that by themselves are really meaningless. But I'm going to fill in a couple of letters in green. And then these letters, this little sentence says, a blessed friend brought breath and ease again. Makes sense, doesn't it? I can take those same letters that I started with that are meaningless and put in a different set of letters. A cursed fiend wrought death, disease, and pain. Now those two sentences are very, very different. But 65% of the letters are identical. The ones that are identical, I could argue, are redundant. They carry no information. The information is carried by the red or the green letters in the slide. It turns out that English is about 75% redundant. And that has an advantage and a disadvantage. The advantage is that if you lose some letters in transmission, you can usually figure out what the guy was trying to get across. So the redundancy is good. On the other hand, it's taking up space. It takes me more than twice, 2.5 times as much space to write English as it would having that redundancy gone. We'll discover in English that vowels pretty much are redundant. So most cryptographers will drop vowels before encryption because all cryptography hangs on redundancy. All the breaking of codes depends on the redundancy that's in the language. On the other hand, redundancy is good because it improves the signal-to-noise ratio. And so one of the questions is, what will an extraterrestrial language look like? It's likely to be non-redundant, so it maximizes the bandwidth, and it will use some other techniques to correct errors. Well, let's talk about some other discoveries. If I talk about trigonometry, and I mention a triangle, and I add the angles in a triangle, what does it add up to? 180 degrees, whether it's a 30, 60, 90 triangle or a 45, 45, 90, it always adds up to 100 degrees. Well, suppose I go out in the field with a transit and lay out a very large triangle, take down the angles and bring them into you, and you add up the angles and it adds up to more than 180 degrees. You figure, what would you think? Well, Chuck screwed up again. No, it turns out that little rule we all learned, that angles add up to 180 degrees, is true for a universe of only 2 dimensions. It's called plane geometry or plane trigonometry. If we have a triangle of less than 180 degrees, it's in a concave surface. If it's in more than 100 degrees, it's in a convex surface. Of course, in navigation, you'll quickly have to learn something about spherical trigonometry, where you can have a triangle with 90 degrees in each corner. And it was this kind of insight that Dr. Einstein was grappling with. He realized, as he was grappling with problems of our space and time reality, he realized that space is not just 3 dimensions. The way he solved his problem is to realize that there were 4 dimensions. And that led to a special theory of relativity with length, mass, and velocity and time are relative. And that was generalized 10 years later in this general theory of relativity. And the key thing for us is that he recognized that there's no distinction between time and space. A physicist will generally not speak of space or time separately. He'll speak of space-time. We live in a 4-dimensional continuum. This has been confirmed more than 12 ways to more than 14 decimal. So there's 4 dimensions. Now, you and I tend to think of time as linear. When we were in school, the teacher went to the blackboard and wrote a line from left to right. The beginning of a segment would be a person's life, a birth, say, and the right end would be his death. Or the beginning would be a founding of an empire, and the right end would be the end of that empire, whatever. How many of you made timelines in school? Okay, so you're with me. Well, because of that, when we think of eternity, we think of a line that starts at infinity on the left and goes to infinity on the right. When we think of God, we think of someone who has lots of time. That's very poetic. It's in our hymns, Amazing Grace, when we've been there 10,000 years and all that sort of thing. But it happens to be bad physics. God is not subject to gravity, not subject to mass, those constraints. God is not somebody who has lots of time. He's someone that's outside time altogether. Time is a physical property. We exist in more than 3 dimensions. Time varies with mass, acceleration, or gravity. If we have an atomic clock here on the platform and I raise it 1 meter, it speeds up by 1 part in 10 to the 16th. That's not a fault of the clock. Time actually speeds up because of the difference in gravity. In 1971, the United States Naval Observatory put an atomic clock on an aircraft around the world eastward, left one at the observatory, and the one that went around the world lost 0.0 microseconds compared to the one at rest at the university, at the observatory. And they did the same thing with another clock going westward, went around the world, and it gained 0.27 microseconds. Not a lot, obviously a very, very tiny amount, but predictable and measurable, and confirmed the theory. And the other example that's usually offered is 2 astronauts, hypothetical astronauts. And we're going to leave one here on the Earth. We're going to, in our mind's eye, we're going to send the other one to the nearest star and back. The nearest star happens to be Alpha Centauri. It's about 4.5 light years away. And if we apply the Lorentz transformations to this, it turns out that if we send him at 50% of the speed of light to the star 4.5 light years away, take 9 years to get there, 9 years back, so the round trip will take 18 years on his calendar, except when he gets back to the Earth, he'll discover that his twin brother is 2 years and 9 months older than he is, that he's arrived 2 years, 9 months younger than his twin brother, born at the same instant. And if that doesn't bother you, you weren't listening carefully, okay? To extend it one more, there's some other problems here, but let me just presume I could send him at 99.99% of the speed of light. In that case, the round trip to 4.5 light years away would take him 9 years in his clock, but during that time, the Earth will have aged 636 years. And obviously, we hope he bought some Microsoft stock before he left. My favorite quote of Dr. Einstein is that people like us who believe in physics, he said, know that the distinction between the past, the present, and the future is only a stubbornly persistent illusion. So we really have two major discoveries that motivate our study here. We have in our possession, first of all, an integrated message system. We have 66 books penned by 40 different guys over thousands of years. So the first discovery is that it's an integrated message. Every detail, every number, every place name we discover is there by design. I'll show you how. Some of the codes reveal that, especially the macro codes. The other side of the coin, though, is not only that, but we can prove that the origin of this message system is from outside our time domain. And that's really the main power of these codes, and one reason we're spending our time on them. We know these codes come from outside time, and this is the way God authenticates it. He says, that's what Isaiah means, is the high and lofty one that inhabiteth eternity. That's his. God is not somebody who has lots of time. He inhabits eternity. He's outside time altogether. And the way he authenticates his message is to demonstrate an attribute that he alone has, no other one does. Declaring the end from the beginning and from the ancient times of things that are not yet done, Isaiah tells us. God boasts that I alone know the end from the beginning. So when we find a message that demonstrates that its origins from outside time, and it does that by writing history before it happens in such detail as to defy speculation, and does it with perfect accuracy, we begin to realize that it is from whom we think it is. Now, we talked about time as a line. Here I'm trying to render it in 3 dimensions, as a line passing through 3 dimensions. And there are people in the past, we're here in the present, there's people coming in the future. From the point of view of eternity, those 3 periods that we regard as sequential could appear in eternity as simultaneous. I'm just suggesting this to stretch your imagination a little bit. I also sometimes like to point out that someone that died in the past, someone that died last week, and someone that might be raptured a week from Tuesday, all might arrive at the throne at the same instant. So that should bother you. Let's move on. Now, are there hidden codes in the Bible? It's the glory of God to conceal a thing, honor of kings to search out a matter. And I want to show you some quick transpositions here. There are codes in the Bible. They're well known to anybody that's had a course in cryptology. If you take the Hebrew alphabet, and I'm showing it left to right here, which is really wrong, but I think we're more used to that, and I take the second half of the alphabet and put it underneath the first half, I now have a cipher alphabet. I can take any letter and substitute its counterpart in a message. And that technique is called in Hebrew albam. We find it in Isaiah chapter 6. The name Tabeel turns out to be the name Ramallah encrypted by albam. And what this does is reveal a hint about the plot of the kings in Isaiah 7, that if it had succeeded, what the result would have been. There's another form in which I reverse it. I take the second half and fold it under the others backwards. I just wrap it around, if you will, and build my cipher alphabet. And that's called Atbash. We find it occurring in Jeremiah 25 and also Jeremiah 51. In both those cases, we encounter the word that's translated Shishak. Your commentaries will speculate that it's probably a suburb of Babylon because they can tell from the context that it's actually alluding to Babylon. But it's in the Midrash we discover that it is a form of Atbash encryption of the name Babel or Babylon. So Shishak and Babylon are the same thing. One is the encryption of the other. We find the same technique called Atbash in Jeremiah 51 verse 1, where Leb Kamai is substituted, which means heart of my enemy, is encryption of Kajdim, which is the word for Chaldeans. Again, these aren't profound discoveries. They are just considered, among cryptologists, historical oddities that are embodied in the ancient Hebrew literature. But to someone who holds a supernatural view of the Bible's origins, these are what a rabbi would call a remez. It's a hint of something deeper. We have, of course, the fall of Babylon, where you all know the party that they had. Belshazzar was throwing this big party, and for 1,000 of his lords and nobles, when the Persians were presumably ready to attack, which was pretty stupid on his part, and right in the middle of the party, on the wall, they find some handwriting that none of the experts could unravel. And the Queen Mother, Nebuchadnezzar's widow, he'd passed away, of course. It was a grandson that was a co-regent on the throne. She says there was a guy, your father, that could do these things, call him out of retirement, which they do. And Daniel comes by, and the Hebrew tradition is that this was encrypted in Atbash originally. He translates these letters into the famous handwriting on the wall. Remember, Hebrew goes from right to left. Remember that. All languages go towards Jerusalem. Did you know that? But the first word is many, which means numbered or reckoned. God hath numbered thy kingdom and finished it in the King James. Or as we might say, your number is up. And then the next one was tekel or weighed. Thou art weighed in the balances and art found wanting. And the last word is Perez, which is broken or divided. Thy kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and the Persians. What most people don't realize is the vowels here. See, the other thing about Hebrew is there are no vowels. It's been designed for bandwidth compression for extraterrestrial transmission. I think that's very interesting. There are no vowels. And also discover later it's also self-parsing. It's the only language on the planet Earth that appears. It has those very characteristics that you would design in an alphabet. But Perez means broken or divided if you infer an E. But if you infer an A, it's the name for the Persians. It's a pun, if you will, in the Aramaic in which it's written. Now, the Bible codes, as you know, Michael Drosnin's book, The Bible Code, is created this big sensation. And it deals with just one kind of encryption called the equidistant letter sequences. And one of the questions you and I have is, are there really hidden codes in the Bible? This is not a recent phenomenon, by the way. The Kabbalists, the various venerated rabbis of the past, have felt from the beginning that the Torah is not only describes the creation, but was the very template that God used to do the creation. They've had a very, very high and mystical view of the text from the beginning. But even in the 16th century, Rabbi Moses Cordovero made the remark, the secrets of the Torah are revealed in the skipping of letters. You'll find these kinds of quotes in a lot of the ancient Jewish literature. The Kabbalists, and that word means many different things to many different people. The Kabbalah is a form of Jewish mysticism that's occultic. But the term actually means received lore and is used several different ways. The Talmud uses it in the sense of oral traditions and lore passed on verbally. The term also refers to the writing of authority to give a rabbi the authority to conduct certain kinds of kosher practices. The term has many different meanings. It generally refers to the ancient scribes and some of the beliefs and views they held about the text. Many of their views were kept in secret because they were going through such severe persecution. As the centuries go by, one of the most fruitful times in Jewish literature was in the 12th and 13th and 14th centuries in Spain. Many places, but in Spain particularly. As you recall, it was in October of 1492 that any Jew left in Spain would be killed. That's why Columbus and his crew boarded before midnight of that deadline his vessels that head to the New World. There's a whole thing there you might find interesting to look into. But the point is, much of what the ancient rabbis learned were kept secret or encrypted or hidden. And the burden of current rabbis in Judaism is to try to rediscover what they believed those guys used to know. And so that's why some of these quotes are so highly venerated in Judaism today. There was a guy by the name of Weissmandel, about the time of the First World War. Well, at the age of 13, he was able to get his hands on a few of the ancient books by some of the ancient rabbis. He became fascinated with the Torah. And he was in the habit of copying them down 10 letters across on cards, in a standard practice in cryptography. And he started to study deeply the text itself in a cryptographic sense, what you and I would call a cryptographic sense. And he made a number of interesting discoveries. Let me just share one of them, and this goes back to the period between World War I and World War II. Weissmandel, by the way, was on a train to Auschwitz and was able to escape. And he spent his life trying to do just the same kind of thing that Schindler did, trying to buy freedom for Jews. And he was obviously absorbed with that. But he also did make some discoveries. Now, the word Torah, which is the law, in Hebrew is spelled with 4 letters. Now remember that Hebrew goes from right to left. All languages go towards Jerusalem. Did you know that? English, German, French, Spanish, Latin, everything west of Jerusalem goes from left to right. Languages that are east of Jerusalem, Hebrew, Aramaic, Sanskrit, Chinese, whatever, go from right to left. They all go towards Jerusalem. I think it's I don't know what you do with that piece of information, but I just thought I'd mention it. But when we're talking Hebrew, we're going from right to left. You got used to that. The word Torah in Hebrew is in four letters: a tau, a vav, a resh, and a he. I have transliterated it for us so we get comfortable with it to our Western way of thinking. T-O-R-H is a way of sort of transliterating the word Torah. What's interesting, if you go to the book of Genesis, Bereshit, bara Elohim, if you go to the first tau, or T in effect, and you count 49 letters, take the next one, now the interval of 49 letters, the next one is a vav, okay, which is sort of like an O. And then you count another 49 letters, you come to a resh, and another 49 letters, and you come to a he. So here's the name Torah spelled out in what you could consider a Cardano grill of 49-letter intervals. Okay? Say, that's kind of curious. By the way, I have no idea what else he did with his time, to find these kinds of things. But you look at this and you say, well, gee, that's curious. That could have been just accident of circumstance. Yes, except if you go to the book of Exodus, same thing happens. You go to the first tau and count 49 letters. You come to a vav. You count 49 letters. You come to a resh. Count 49 letters. And you come to a he. The T-O-R-H equivalents, or Torah. Again, it's spelled with the same intervals. Well, you quickly come to the conclusion that can't be totally by chance, on the one hand. On the other hand, try sometime conducting a story, writing a story that will fit that kind of model. It ain't easy, okay? Try it sometime. But we're not through. If you try this on Leviticus, it doesn't work. But if you go to Numbers, it does work if you spell Torah backwards. Now, why would somebody bother is one of your questions, right? But it works. It happens. You go to the first hey, and you count 49 letters, you get to the resh, you count 49 letters, you get to the vav, and you get 49 letters, you get to the t. In other words, it's as if you spelled Torah backwards. Okay? Again, 49-letter intervals. Go to the book of Deuteronomy, the same equivalent thing happens. We're dealing here with 49-letter intervals, which of course is 7 squared, 7 times 7. 49-letter intervals. Genesis goes forward, Exodus it goes forward, Numbers goes backwards, Deuteronomy goes backwards. Let's take a little closer look at Leviticus. 49 doesn't seem to work, but the number 7 does. If you take intervals of 7, you get a yot, a he, a vav, and a he, which of course is the Yahweh, the unpronounceable, ineffable name of God. How interesting. That in itself is interesting. But let's put together what we know. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Exodus, we've got Torah spelled forwards. Exodus, we've got forward. Numbers, backwards. Deuteronomy, backwards. It seems that the Torah always points to the name of God. Do you see design here? Now, you got two views about this. One view is that this is just the accident of circumstance. It's just a statistical oddity. There are Bible teachers that take that position. This is just statistics, an artifact of the Hebrew language. And by the way, there are some peculiar things about the Hebrew language that favors this kind of thing. There are books being written that try to point out all the reasons why this is an artifact of the Hebrew language. The Hebrew language has great density. There's only 22 letters. There's no vowels. It's designed to be very dense, to make maximum use of the available bandwidth. My argument's the other way around. Maybe Hebrew lends itself to this in order to have the codes. Think about it. Let's move on. It's interesting that the Kabbalists and their textual traditions is what led to the cryptology that had its flowering in the Renaissance period. The Renaissance period developed the mechanical age of the cipher wheels and all the rest of it that led to Enigma, the Enigma machines of World War II, which in turn led to the wartime computer development, which led, interestingly enough, to the rediscovery of the codes. You see the loop close? I think that's interesting. The Torah codes, as they're called, really have their roots in Weissmandel, among others. A guy by the name of Daniel Michelson wrote The Codes in the Torah, an article in the Or HaTorah, which is a journal, in 1987. About 1982, actually, a group of very, very bright, world-class mathematicians started looking at what Weis-Mendel discovered and start applying that using a computer, and started to make some discoveries. And these were first mentioned in 1987 in Michelson's article. But the big thing came from Doron Witzum and Elihu Rips and Yoav Rosenberg when they wrote an article on equidistant letter sequences in the book of Genesis. Some years prior, they had published this in the Royal Statistical Journals in Britain. But what makes the Journal of the Institute of Mathematical Statistics so profound is it's a refereed journal. To get an article published there, it has to be reviewed by a group of peers. And there were 8 guys that are all world-class mathematicians that spent 6 years studying their article and finally could not find fault with it, so it was published. Then this whole thing got even more visibility when Dr. Jeffrey Satinover wrote an article, Divine Authorship, which essentially summarizes in a more popular journal called the Bible Review in 1995. So the big furor really starts publicly in 94, 95, 96 time period. One of the things that they first discovered, Whitson and Rips discovered, they had a computer search the Torah for the name Israel. And they decided to take, they looked at the first 10,000 words or letters in the Torah, and they examined all possible intervals, looking for equidistant letter sequences, up to 100, both plus and minus, in other words, forward or backward. And what they found in the first 10,000 letters of Genesis, using that interval things, that the name Israel only appeared twice in Genesis, in the encryption sense, once at an interval of 7 and once at the interval of 50. Now you can make the argument that the thing could just show up by chance, but what disturbed them were those particular intervals were probably not accidental. They're clustered together in Genesis chapter 131 to roughly about the end of chapter 1 of Genesis, in the very passage that is their Kiddush. Every Friday night over a glass of wine, they say the Kiddush. It's based on this. It's related to the Sabbath. The 7, of course, speaks of the Sabbath. And so does the 50, because that speaks of the Jubilee year. The seven weeks of years plus 1, that makes the Jubilee year. So 7 and 50 to a Jew speak of the Sabbath. And here is Israel mentioned in both of those intervals. That caught their attention. Is that coincidence? Theoretically. In Genesis chapter 2, there's a passage starting about verse 29 of chapter 1, ending about verse 9 of chapter 2. The passage opens with, "And God said, Behold, I have given you every herb-bearing seed, which is upon the face of all the earth, and every tree, in the which is the fruit of a tree yielding seed, and to you it shall be for meat." It goes on. The passage this particular area closes then in verse 9 of chapter 2. "And out of the ground made the Lord God to grow every tree that is pleasant to the sight and good for food, the tree of life also in the midst of the garden, and the tree of knowledge of good and evil." Okay? Hidden behind that text are the 25 trees that appear in the Old Testament. And here they're listed. The tamarisk, the terebinth, the fig, the citron, the acacia, and the intervals. The tamarisk shows in intervals of only 2 apart. Terebinth minus 2, in other words, the other direction. Anyway, acacia, almond, wheat, date palm, cedar. Wheat, by the way, is also a term somehow associated with the knowledge of good and evil by some. Cedar, the aloe, the grape, the boxhorn or bramble, acacia, pomegranate, gopherwood, thorn bush or crataegus. The olive, the pistachio nut, the hazel, the fig, the willow, the oak, the vine, the barley, the chestnut, and the poplar. The fact that these trees happen to show up in the Torah is not the point. Many people miss the point. You could argue that they show up to statistically. Any large body of text is bound to have what I call accidental encryptions hidden in it. That's not the point. Here are 25 trees clustered, first point, 2 issues. Clustered in the same area and linked to the relevant plain text. If I treat the scripture itself as the plain text, these are not irrelevant. These are the very clustered behind the very passage that deals with the trees. Follow me? So that catches your attention. Is this some big profound proof? No, but boy, it gets your attention. Let's move on. The statistical science article by Doron Whitsam, Eliyahu Rips, and Yoav Rosenberg, they submit the research results. What they had done is there is a standard document that lists prominent rabbis in Israel. They took the 34 most prominent, prominence being defined by column inches in this critical biography. They took the 34 names of the rabbis, they took their dates of birth and death, and had the computer search for them. The names of the rabbis and their date of birth and date of death were all found encrypted in the Torah. Blew them away. They submit their article for review to statistical science. The reviewers say, gee, that's still possible, kind of strange. What they ask is for 32 more, the next 32 most prominent. So they take those and their dates, birth and death, shoot them in. Every one of them is found. So they accepted the thing for publication after 6 years of analysis of all of this. Now there's some people that tried to run the same test, didn't get quite the right results because they did it sloppily. They didn't do it precisely well enough. There's other people, in fact, the head of the National Security Agency got involved, as I recall. Dr. Harold Gans got involved. They submitted some additional ones, including the places of birth and death and so forth. And they also put in a whole bunch of wrong dates. All that was screened out. Only the right stuff showed up, and they had even better results than the first time. It was estimated that the first 34 was like one chance in 775 million that it could have been by accident. What they also find, as this goes on, are what are known as the Holocaust codes. In Deuteronomy 10, you find Hitler, Auschwitz, and the Holocaust. Deuteronomy 31, the Holocaust, crematorium for my sons. In Poland, find plagues, the Fuhrer, Eichmann, king of the Nazis, genocide, Auschwitz, Germany, Hitler, Mein Kampf. There's the Hebrew intervals are found, and there's the verses they're found in. Is that coincidence? Is that accidental? Some people argue that it is. Some skeptics, and by the way, there's some very bright, good guys that are skeptical of all of this. They took War and Peace in English and searched it and found the names of 13 people that had been assassinated. Yitzhak Rabin, Gandhi, 13 famous people. And they argued, not that there's anything special about War and Peace, is that in any large body of text, if you search hard enough, you can find names. But they missed the point. It's not just the names, it's the relevance to the past, the clustering, the relative. Now, some big guns started to take a look at this. Dr. Harold Gans, first of all, you need to know something about the National Security Agency. That's probably, of the 7 major intelligence agencies in this country, the NSA is the largest. It used to stand, the initials used to stand for no such agency. Nowadays it stands for not secret anymore. In Fort Meade, Maryland. They were a customer of mine in a number of my previous roles. Dr. Harold Gans was the senior mathematician for the National Security, and the resources of Fort Meade are staggering. They have more of the biggest and best of anything you can imagine in support of their mission. But he heard about all this, and he decided to check it out for himself. So he programmed his own computer at home to analyze this. His computations took 440 hours of running, 19 days straight. And when he saw the final result, he was staggered. He believes that there's less than 1 chance in 62,500 that this could have happened by chance. All 8 referees and Dr. Gans have retired from their previous roles and are now teaching the Torah in synagogues around the world. So they're believers in the codes. Now, the exploitation begins. Michael Drosnin, who is not a believer, self-confessed atheist, wrote a book called The Bible Code, which deals with all this background. In the book, he gives you the impression that he was a collaborator with Rips and Whitsam, both of whom have denounced him. He's a name dropper and an exploiter. He claims in his book that the Bible predicts Yitzhak Rabin's assassination. In the passage he uses in Deuteronomy 4, his translations are contrived. Mathematics is spurious. He's not a believer. This book has been attacked successfully, I believe, from both sides. People who are in favor of the codes attack him because he misses the whole point, and his book, they feel, does more harm than good. The people who don't believe in the codes, if you pick up a book against the Bible codes, they're attacking Drosnin's book not necessarily the codes, because that takes more mathematical sophistication than most people bring to the table. So the point is, the Bible code book that's making all the news is a straw man, easy to knock down from either side. It's fortunate in the sense it stirred up a lot of interest. It's unfortunate because it's generated a lot of misunderstandings. Now, Jeffrey Satinover is he has a book called Cracking the Bible Code that is much more competent. He has a deep background in Judaism, and he also is a very sophisticated scientist. And his book is much more to the point, although he sees it all through what I would consider the blinders of Judaism and of Talmudic Judaism. John Weldon has written a book, Decoding the Bible Code, Can We Trust the Message? John Weldon writes some fabulous apologetic books, a very competent guy. Again, his book primarily is effective at debunking Drosnin's book. He takes a number of statements that I would enjoy debating with him on the codes in general. The Jewish community in Israel discovers the codes, the articles go, and all the world is buzzing about the Torah codes, right? And a guy by the name of Yaakov Ramsel, a Messianic Jew in San Antonio, Texas, says, hey guys, you're looking for names, how about the name Yeshua? Do you suppose it's there somewhere? And of course, it turns out that the name Yeshua is encrypted behind almost every Messianic prophecy in the Bible. Well, now this debate takes a three-way swing. There's the pro-codes, the anti-codes, but the Jews who are pro-codes are not too excited about the idea of Yeshua being in there. And Ramsel is a neat guy, good friend. He's the guy that sends me a lot of stuff. That's where I got the acrostics for Esther and some of that stuff. And Grant Jeffries and he became good friends. And Grant Jeffrey published a book called The Signature of God, in which he takes up the support and the defense of the Bible codes. He also helps Yaakov Ramsel publish a book called Yeshua, and a sequel volume called Jesus is My Name. I'll come back to that. And Grant Jeffrey wrote not only The Signature of God, he's written a recent book called The Handwriting of God. And both of us hope to have our books. He's doing another book, Proving the Codes Are Real. And hope to have our book. Both of us are planning to make our books debut in the summer at CBA and whatever. So we'll see what comes of that. Kind of interesting, Grant tells how when this all started, Yeshua codes, he'd get a call from Israel, all upset. Well, Yeshua just means salvation. And Grant would say, no, wait a minute. When you found Hitler, you recognized that as a name. He says, I understand your problem, but it's your problem. Now, you should understand the rebuttal to Yeshua is that Yeshua consists of 4 letters, and 2 of them are the most frequent letters in the Hebrew alphabet. If you study Yeshua in the Old Testament, not just the Torah, the Old Testament, in just looking at intervals of less than 100, it shows up over 5,538 times in the Old Testament. I've done this myself. And 2,919 going forward. And that includes 136 with no intervals. That is the name just spelled, Yeshua. And then 2619 going backwards. So it's very, very common. But I don't see that as a surprise. Jesus himself said, the volume of the book is written of me. I'm not surprised to find his name that frequently. Jesus challenges, search the scriptures, for in them you think you have eternal life. And they are they which testify of what? Me. Yeah, there I am. Here is a list of the frequency tables in the Tanakh, the Old Testament. And obviously the Vav and the Yot and the Vav are the 2 most frequent letters, and the He are the 2 most frequent letters in the scripture. The cynics will say, well, this whole thing is just a statistical accident. Well, let's take a look at the Yeshua codes. In Genesis chapter 1, verse 1, the creation encrypted as Yeshua is able. In Genesis 3:27, Adam and Eve are covered, by the coats of skins. In chapter 3, behind that you have encrypted Yoshaya, he will save. Remember they put on aprons of fig leaves? But then God covered them with skins of animals, teaching them that by the shedding of innocent blood they'd be covered. And behind that text you've got encrypted Yoshaya, he will save. Ruth, which the whole book communicates the kinsman redeemer, Boaz and all that. It opens with a 5-interval sequence, Yeshua. Daniel 9, the 70 weeks, has a 26-letter interval encryption of Yeshua behind it. But that's just the starters, gang. You ready for this? Let's go to Isaiah 53. That was Yaakov Ramsel's first discovery. Here's the high point of the Old Testament. Of all the passages in the Old Testament that deals with the crucifixion of Jesus Christ, you've got Isaiah 53. Encrypted in that is Yeshua Shmi. Yeshua is my name. That's pretty impressive. Stand by.
You have Yeshua is my name, his signature, Messiah, Nazarene, Galilee, Shiloh, Pharisee, Levites, both high priests, Caiaphas and Annas, Passover, the man Herod, wicked Caesar perish. And that evil Roman city, let him be crucified, Moriah, cross, pierced, from the atonement lamb, bread, wine, Obed, Jesse, David's line, of course, seed, water, Jonah, on it goes. Each of these having, you could preach a sermon about any one of these in its linkage to Isaiah 53. You say, that's pretty impressive? Stand by. Here's a list of the disciples. Disciples that mourn: Peter, Matthew, John, Andrew, Philip, Thomas, and 2 Jameses. Not 1, 2. There were 2 Jameses, right? Okay. And you've got Simon, Thaddeus, Matthias, 3 Marys, Salome, and Joseph. Now, it's interesting that one of these Marys and John and Yeshua are all linked together sharing the same yacht. Remember where Jesus looks down at John and consigns Mary? It's interesting. Obviously all by statistical accident. 40 names in 15 sentences, encrypted. They're clustered, relevant. It's the clustering, it's not just the names, the clustering and the relevance that is the profound aspect of this. People say it's a statistical accident. I want you to examine this paragraph on the screen. There's something hidden in this paragraph, and I want to see if you can find it. The paragraph says, upon this basis, I'm going to show you how a bunch of bright young folks did find a champion. A man with boys and girls of his own. A man of so dominating and happy an individuality that youth is drawn to him as is a fly to a sugar bowl. It is a story about a small town. It is not a gossipy yarn, nor is it a dry, monotonous account full of such customary fill-ins as romantic moonlight casting murky shadows down a long, winding country road. And it goes on. Here's a paragraph that has something about it that's weird. Something about this paragraph, if you examine it carefully, should bother you. There's a paragraph without a single E in it. There's not an E there. Now, the letter E is the most frequent letter in the English language. And that's what Samuel Morse, in making his Morse code, made the dot, the one dot, an E. It's the most frequent letter, it's the shortest thing. The whole Morse code was his attempt to make it frequency sensitive. The most frequent letters are the shortest. The least frequent are the longest in his Morse code. Well, E's occur in English about 13% of the time. You say, well, that's just a statistic. Okay. Try writing a sentence without using an E. It ain't easy. Now, you could probably do it. He did it. In fact, he did more than that. The question you want to think about, what's the chance of that paragraph that you just read happening by accident? Pretty unlikely. In fact, what if I told you that paragraph came from a 267-page novel called Gatsby, a story of 50,000 words without using the letter E. It was published in 1939 by Ernest Vincent Wright. And in order to pull this off, he could not use any past tense, no EDs. Couldn't use she, he, they, we, her. You start thinking about the words that he had to abandon, the list gets very onerous. He actually had to tie down the E of his typewriter to avoid it happening by accident. He could not use any number which, if spelled, had an E in it. It was a self-imposed task. He decided to try, and he did, and it's obviously just a literary curiosity. But it demonstrates something, that trying to violate the basic statistical behavior of language is not easy. And those violations are a contradiction to chance. They're an evidence of effort. The absence of E in a full novel is phenomenal. The absence of E in a paragraph itself is something what you went home and tried to do, you would really have to work at it. It's not something that happens by accident. What's the chance of 40 people who are at the foot of the cross being encrypted behind the text of the crucifixion as prophesied in the book of Isaiah 8 centuries before Christ was born? Come on. David Kashdan, chairman of the Department of Mathematics at Harvard, says the phenomenon is real. Of course, what it means is up to the individual. I don't want to leave this subject, though, without touching on another aspect that is valid. In the interest of time here, I haven't given you a whole history of the Kabbalah or Pythagoras and the mystical brother, the secret brotherhood he formed in Italy that became fashionable among the Greeks, and the worship of numbers. Not just discoveries of mathematics, but the worship of numbers is somehow something very mystical. Many people ascribe the Pythagorean mysticism of the Greeks as infusing Judaism. And some of that's probably true. At the same time, the Kabbalists went long before, centuries before Judaism. We'll talk about some of that in our subsequent sessions. But there is a danger in getting involved in this kind of thing. There's a lure, if you will, of this. Now, there are some of the critics of the codes that I believe are very myopic. Some very prominent authors who I really respect and I love their work have said some things that I regard as being a bit myopic. They say that there's no truth in God's word that the common man can't understand. I don't believe that's true. Jesus did say that God's truths are revealed to babes and hidden from the wise and prudent. He's talking about the gospel. He's talking about God's central truths, and I applaud that. That's absolutely true. But to go the other way around, I think is a mistake. To presume that there's nothing in the Scripture but what a common man can understand is to put God in a box that's naive and absurd. I don't think the Bible, I think anyone with an IQ of 50 can understand the gospel. But that doesn't mean everything in the Bible is limited to an IQ of 50. You follow what I'm saying? That's a funny way of saying it, perhaps, and I'm sure I'm going to get some nasty letters on that. Let me give you an example of what I mean. There was a guy by the name of Matthew Fontaine Maury. He read in the Psalms. There's a psalm there where there's pathways in the sea. He says pathways in the sea, and that became an obsession. So he became a midshipman, made his life study trying to find the pathways in the sea, ended up founding the whole field of oceanography. When you go to the Naval Academy, you march from the dormitory of Bancroft Hall down Stribling Walk to the main academic group. The head of it is Maury Hall, named after Matthew Fontaine Maury. He was in a position to get all kinds of ships, sailing ships all over the world, to capture temperature data and current data, and he made maps of the ocean currents. He discovered the ocean currents and much more. And the point is, all of this out of what? Out of his obsession with one verse in the Bible. And there are pathways in the seas. It's an interesting thing where the discovery follows the reference in the Scripture. And there's dozens of these that are far more sophisticated that we'll be taking out lately. So to limit God is naive. I don't ever put God in a box. But clearly, there is a misuse of the codes, and that's what Drosnin, in effect, is doing. He's trying to use these strange codes as a form of fortune-telling. Trying to make the Bible, the text of the Bible, a Ouija board. Which if you do the right things, you'll have it tell who's going to get killed when. And that's nonsense. One of the best spokesmen of this issue is Grant Jeffries. He pushes the codes hard. He does a good job defending them. But he always makes the point that the codes are not to predict the future. The codes are there so when the future happens, God is glorified. The codes in Isaiah 53 don't describe the details of the cross. But when you see the details of the cross and you go back, you can see God's fingerprints all over the text from outside time. So there's a very subtle difference here between recognizing the fulfillment of prophecy and not using the Bible for divination. And divination in the Torah is prohibited. To do that in ancient Israel was a capital crime. You didn't get scolded, you got stoned. There's another side to this too, a close cousin of this, and that's the lure of the occult. Somebody said, well, Chuck, you're getting into mysticism. Well, first of all, try finding an adequate definition of mysticism. It's not easy. Mysticism is defined as having a direct experience with God and trying to seek it outside God's word is the occult. But mysticism in and of itself, I don't apologize for. Why? Because Paul was a mystic. His highest dream was to be in Christ. Have Christ in you. John, the same thing. John and Paul are unabashedly Christian mystics. Not in the Gnostic sense, not in the heresy sense, hardly. But now there is an attempt at mysticism outside the plain teaching of God. And the divination thing is an example. Here are people using the Bible for divination when the Bible prohibits divination. Stop, guys, think about it. And clearly the Kabbalah, the term today, is used in a denotative way. The word Kabbalah today really refers to the occultic mysticism that grew up in Judaism. It had its flowering primarily in the 12th, 13th, 14th century. It was opposed to Talmudic Judaism in many ways. The word Kabbalah in the Talmud knows nothing of mysticism in the usual sense. They use it differently. But the Kabbalah, as you might hear the term today, refers to all these speculations, Jewish mystical speculations of the what they call the Geonic era. And close akin to this is the area of gematria. The Hebrew alphabet and the Greek alphabet were unique in that each letter had a numerical value. And that has all kinds of implications, and we will have some real surprises for you the next time we meet on this subject. Because gematria is disparaged by most Bible scholars, but much to everyone's shock, there is some interesting gematria in the Scripture. In 1 Kings 7:23, there is a mathematical formula for pi that has been overlooked for centuries. Also, everybody that talks about, all the scholars say, well, there's no gematria in the Bible, except, of course, for Revelation 13:18, the 666. Is that gematria or not? Well, that's a whole other subject for another night. But in the early church, the Gnostic heresies were all hung up with mysticism and this sort of thing. So be on your guard. There is a dark side of the coin. Now, in the forthcoming sessions, we're going to talk about microcodes. Jesus said that not one jot or one tittle shall pass from the law till all be fulfilled. Now, a jot is one of the little letters, a little apostrophe kind of thing. A tittle is the little decorative hook on certain letters. There are some amazing discoveries to be made as you get a little closer to the Hebrew language and how the Scripture takes advantage of some of its subtleties. But the thing that everyone has overlooked, and that's the one we're going to talk about most in the subsequent sessions, and that's macrocodes. Microcodes are the microcosmic, macro is the macrocosm. There are macrocodes. Macrocodes stand back and look at the whole. If you're on a computer, there's a code that speaks of a whole list of other codes. You call those macros. In your word processor, if you're going to send a fax, you can hit one key and it'll format your fax for you. Or if it's not a fax, if it's email, it's something else. The point is, there are macros. If you have some common thing you do all the time in your letters or in your writing, you can, in most sophisticated word processing programs, build your own macro. You tell it a whole bunch of things you want it to do, and then when you tell it that, it'll do it for you in advance or either after the fact or before the fact. They're called macros, but they're macro codes. In computer programming, we're constantly dealing with macros, calling of subroutines and other things. Well, the Bible is full of macro codes. And what's exciting about these is you don't need a computer to sort them out. Some of the critics of the so-called equidistant letter sequences say that's not like God to put you at the disposal of elitists. You can't find these equidistant letter sequences, ELSs they call them, without a computer and all the Spanish software. Well, clearly, what they're fearful of is having a new priesthood. That you know more, the guy that knows most about the Bible, the guy that's got the biggest disk, the fastest computer, and the latest software. Well, that's nonsense. God is not a God of the elitists. That doesn't mean, though, that some of those things can't be fruitful in identifying and authenticating the source of the message. But macro codes, which we'll get into in a subsequent session, are codes which you don't need a computer for, and they are absolutely breathtaking. And we'll also talk about metacodes. That's beyond our own horizon. Is there a relationship with all of this with the DNA? Is the DNA as a 3 out of 4 error-correcting code? That's interesting. There are two concepts in mathematics that do not exist in the physical world. One of them is infinity. It does not exist in astronomy because the universe is finite. It also doesn't exist in the microcosmic world because you can get to a point where you can no longer divide something in half. Quantum physics is a denial of infinity on the bottom side. And the finiteness of our universe on the upside says there's no infinity is a mathematical concept that we don't find in the physical universe. There's another concept that is amazingly absent from the universe. It's called randomness. The field of mathematics called theory of chaos, or chaos theory, is in effect a study and a refutation of the existence of real chance. that even the way smoke curls up in the sky is